The first time Gertrude Slater told a man to go straight to the devil, she was 17 years old and standing in the middle of her father's wheat field with a hoe in her hands and a look in her eye that could have cured leather. By the time she was 26, she had refined that particular talent into something approaching an art form, and the men of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1882, had learned to give her a respectful amount of room. She was not unpleasant to look at, which was part of the problem, at least according to the women who gathered at the dry goods store on Saturday mornings to compare opinions. Gertrude had dark auburn hair that she wore in a practical braid down her back, green eyes sharp enough to cut glass, and the kind of bone structure that painters would have wept over if painters had ever made their way this far south into Kansas. She was tall for a woman, broad in the shoulder from years of honest work, and she moved through the world with a purposeful stride that suggested she had somewhere important to be and very little patience for anything that stood between her and that destination. She owned 40 acres of good grazing land just northeast of town, a respectable herd of 23 cattle, a small farmhouse that she had spent the better part of 2 years making into something close to comfortable, and a reputation for independence that was equal parts admired and resented depending on who you asked. Her father had died 3 winters prior, leaving her the land outright, and her mother had passed when Gertrude was 12, so there was no one left to tell her what she ought to do, which suited her fine. The trouble was the fence line. It had started in the spring, when the rains came harder than usual, and the creek that ran along the western edge of her property flooded out a good 100 yards of her cedar post fencing. Without that fence, her cattle drifted, and when her cattle drifted, they ended up mingling with the livestock from the Hadley operation to the west, which belonged to a gruff man named Clarence Hadley, who had made it known on more than one occasion that he considered Gertrude's continued ownership of those 40 acres to be something of an inconvenience to his expansion plans. She had ridden into Caldwell that particular Tuesday morning in June with a list of supplies she needed and a firm intention to hire herself a hand. Not a permanent one, she told herself. Just someone capable of helping her reset those fence posts before Hadley got any ideas about claiming the land through neglect. She needed someone who could follow instructions without spending half the day arguing about them, someone who could swing a post driver without complaining, and someone who would be gone again before she had to start feeding him through a Kansas winter. What she found, instead, was Amos Sullivan sitting on the front steps of the Caldwell Hotel with his boots crossed at the ankle, his hat tipped forward against the morning sun, and a folded newspaper resting open across his knee as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use it leisurely. He was, she noted with the kind of involuntary observation that she always resented in herself, an exceptionally well-made man. Not pretty, not in the way that some men were pretty and knew it and became insufferable about it. He was somewhere around 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that suggested stubbornness even in repose. He had a rangy, capable build, the kind that came from years of actual physical labor rather than the kind men performed in front of an audience, and his hands, she noticed when he shifted the newspaper, were the hands of someone who knew how to work. He glanced up as she passed, and she looked away immediately and kept walking. She made her inquiries at the hardware store, where old Pete Granville shook his head and told her that anyone worth hiring had already been snatched up for the cattle drives north. She tried the feed store. She tried asking old Mabel Doris, who ran the rooming house, whether any of her current tenants were looking for work. Mabel thought for a moment and said, well, there was that Sullivan fellow at the hotel. He'd been in town about 4 days and didn't seem to be in any particular hurry to be anywhere. Gertrude went back to the hotel steps, therefore, because she was a practical woman and practicality was not always comfortable. He was still there. He had turned a page in the newspaper. She stopped in front of him and said without preamble, "Are you looking for work?" He looked up slowly, taking his time about it, and she watched his eyes track up from her boots to her face with an unhurried assessment that was irritating precisely because it did not feel disrespectful. It felt instead like the kind of look a man gave something he was genuinely trying to understand. "Depends on the work," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, with a faint trace of something that might have been Kentucky in it. "Fence repair," she said. 100 yards of cedar post line on a 40-acre spread northeast of town. Creek flooded it out in the spring. I need it reset before the summer is out." He considered this. "What does it pay?" $1.50 a day and your meals," she said. "Good meals. I cook well." "I don't doubt it," he said, and the corners of his mouth moved in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile which she decided to ignore. "There are conditions," she said. He folded the newspaper carefully along its original crease and set it on the step beside him. "Go ahead. You do the work the way I tell you to do it. I know that land better than you do. I know where the soil is soft and where the posts need to go deeper, and I know which stretch of line needs to hold against a spring flood and which stretch can afford to be more modest. I'm not interested in having a hired hand who thinks he knows better and wants to spend time convincing me of it. If I tell you to drive a post 4 feet deep, you drive it 4 feet deep. If I tell you to string the wire with 2.5-inch spacing, that is the spacing you use. Can you manage that?" He looked at her steadily for a long moment. There was something thoughtful in his expression, something that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge and was possibly both of those things at once. "I'm listening already," he said. She blinked. It was not the response she had expected. She had expected either the short bristling that men usually produced when a woman spoke to them with authority, or the overly agreeable nodding that was its own kind of condescension, the kind that said I'll tell her what she wants to hear and do it my own way anyway. He had said neither of those things. He had said he was listening. And there was something in his tone that suggested he meant it literally, that he had in fact been listening to every word she said and found nothing in it objectionable. "Good," she said, after a pause that was perhaps a half-second longer than it should have been. "I'm Gertrude Slater. The ranch is called the Slater Place. Everybody knows it." "Amos Sullivan," he said, and stood up, and he was taller than she had reckoned on. He put out his hand and she shook it, which was not something she always did, but he had offered it the way you offered a hand to someone you considered an equal, flat and direct, and without any of the soft affectation some men used with women, as though they were handling china. "Can you start tomorrow morning?" she said. "I can start this afternoon if you need it," he said. She did need it, but she spent 2 more seconds pretending to think about it before she said, "This afternoon, then." "I'll be going back after I finish my errands. You can ride with me or follow on your own." "I'll follow," he said. "I've got my horse at the livery." She nodded and walked away, and she did not look back to see if he was watching her go, which was a discipline she had developed over the years and found useful for her peace of mind. He showed up at her gate 40 minutes after she did, riding a good-looking roan with a steady eye, and she showed him the bunkhouse, which was a generous name for what was really a converted storage shed with a cot, a wood stove, and a hook on the wall. He looked around it without complaint and put his saddlebags down on the floor with the easy acceptance of a man who had slept in worse. "I'll show you the fence line before the light goes," she said, and he followed her out to the western edge of the property, where the damage was laid out plain to see. 110 yards of posts either knocked flat or leaning at bad angles, the wire tangled and broken in places, the ground still soft and uneven from where the creek had run over it. He crouched down and looked at the soil, pressed 2 fingers into the earth, and was quiet for a minute. "The posts that are still standing," he said, "some of them might be worth keeping if you can check their depth. Ground shifting in a flood can loosen them without actually taking them out." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't have you pull them all the day I hired you. I want to go through them one by one tomorrow morning, check each one for stability before we decide what stays and what comes out." He looked at her with that same steady attention she had noticed on the hotel steps. "That's a sensible approach," he said. She had expected him to suggest they just pull everything and start fresh, because that was what men usually suggested, the approach that required the most dramatic action and the least careful thought. The fact that he hadn't done that produced in her a small internal revision that she noted and set aside. They started work the next morning at first light, which in June in Kansas meant the sky was going pink by 5:30, and there was already heat building in the east. Gertrude was out at the fence line with a bucket of water and a pry bar by 5:45, and he was already there before her, having apparently risen even earlier, and he had brought his own pry bar and a pair of leather gloves that were so worn they looked almost soft. She tested the first post, rocking it in its hole, and found it still solid. She moved to the second. He started at the other end of the damaged section and worked toward her, and they developed a rhythm without discussing it, each of them testing their way toward the middle, calling out to the other when they found a post that needed pulling. It was, she reflected, surprisingly easy to work alongside him. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary talk. He did not offer opinions on how she was testing the posts. When she found a post that needed to come out and called to him for help with the pry bar, he came and applied his strength where she directed it. And when she said deeper on the left side of the hole before we reset this one, he dug deeper on the left side without asking why. By the end of the first day, they had assessed the whole damaged section, pulled out 18 posts that were too compromised to use, and redriven 6 that had been merely loosened. He ate the supper she put in front of him, which was a good thick beef stew with cornbread, and he said it was the best meal he'd had since he left Abilene, and then he excused himself politely and went to the bunkhouse. She sat at her kitchen table for a while after he left, doing her accounts, but she found her pencil stilling in her hand more than once, and her attention drifting without her entirely meaning it to. He was different from the men she was accustomed to dealing with. That was all she allowed herself to think about it. He was different, and it made things simpler, which was a practical advantage and nothing more. The second day they began setting new posts, and this was where things got interesting. She had a system for setting cedar posts in creek-adjacent ground, one she had developed after the previous flood 2 years ago had taken out a shorter section of the same fence line. The standard method was to set the post in the hole and pack the dirt around it, which worked fine in stable ground but not in soil that was going to get saturated every spring. Her method involved a layer of gravel at the base of each hole before the post went in, which improved drainage and reduced heave. She explained this to him while she was showing him how deep she wanted the first hole dug. He did not say that was an interesting idea, or that he would try it her way, or any of the other responses that would have contained within them the implication that it was her way as opposed to the right way. He said, "Gravel layer first," and started digging. When they stopped for the midday meal, sitting in the shade of her wagon because the June sun was genuinely brutal by noon, she found herself asking him where he'd come from. He was quiet for a moment, chewing his bread, and she thought he might not answer, and she was already preparing to tell herself that was fine, she had not needed to ask. "Kentucky originally," he said. "Moved out west about 7 years ago. Worked cattle up in Wyoming for a while, then down into Colorado. Did some freighting. Did some of whatever needed doing." "What brought you to Caldwell?" "I was heading toward Dodge," he said. "I had heard there might be work there. Stopped here because my horse threw a shoe, and while Pete Granville was replacing it, I thought I'd rest for a day or two." "And then 4 days passed," she said. He glanced at her sideways, and this time the almost smile became an actual one, brief but genuine, and it changed his face considerably. "Something like that," he said. She looked away toward the fence line and ate the rest of her bread. That evening he asked if he could use her water trough to wash up before supper, which was a reasonable request, and she said yes, and she was very deliberate about not watching from the kitchen window while he did, focusing instead on the potatoes she was peeling with intense concentration. On the third day they had a disagreement. It was about the wire stringing, specifically about the tension. She wanted the wire strung tight, tight enough to resist a panicked steer leaning against it, because she'd had a steer do exactly that 3 summers ago, and a loosely strung fence was worse than no fence at all when a half-ton animal decided to test it. He agreed with her on the tension, which surprised her slightly, but he disagreed about the spacing of the horizontal strands. She wanted 4 strands with 8-inch spacing. He thought 3 strands with 10-inch spacing would use less wire and accomplish the same thing. 3 strands will not hold a calf that decides it's interested in what's on the other side, she said. With that kind of tension on the wire and cedar posts of this quality, 3 strands would hold a full-grown bull, he said, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that was not pure deference. It was not obstinacy. It was simply a man who had an opinion he believed was correct and was stating it clearly. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and he did not look away. "Have you strung wire in Creek country before?" she asked. "I have," he said. "About 40 miles south of Cheyenne, spring of '78, similar soil conditions. We used 3-strand. And did that fence hold? For 3 years until I left Wyoming. Might still be holding for all I know." She was quiet for a moment. He had not raised his voice. He had not become defensive. He had presented his evidence with the same calm directness he applied to everything else, and he was still looking at her with that level, attentive expression that she was finding increasingly difficult to categorize. "I want 4 strands on the section closest to the creek bed," she said, "where the ground is softest and the flood pressure would be highest. 3 strands on the remaining sections. That's my decision." "That's a good decision," he said, without any trace of resentment, and picked up the wire spool. She stood there for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary before she followed him. By the end of the first week, they had reset all the posts and begun stringing wire, and the fence line was starting to look like something that would hold. Her cattle had been confined to the eastern pasture since the flooding, which was not ideal for the grazing, and she could see them watching the work with bovine interest from across the property. She found herself looking forward to the suppertime conversations in a way that she did not examine too closely. He asked her questions about the land, about the cattle, about how she managed the herd through a Kansas winter, and he listened to her answers with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, as though what she was saying was genuinely worth hearing. He did not offer improvements on her methods or suggest she might want to reconsider her approach. When he had useful information, he shared it with a sort of easy openness, the way one person shares knowledge with another person they respect, not the way a man shares knowledge with a woman he is trying to impress or instruct. He told her about the cattle country up in Wyoming, about the winters there that made a Kansas winter look charitable, about the way the ranches up north were organized, the big outfits with their bunkhouses full of men and their cookhouses and their enormous spring and fall roundups. He had worked as a hand on one of those big outfits for 2 years before it stopped suiting him. "Why did it stop suiting you?" she asked one evening. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and thought about it for a moment. "I don't do well with a lot of people telling me what to do when none of them are telling me the same thing," he said. "Out on a big spread like that, you've got the foreman saying one thing and the trail boss saying another thing and the owner saying a third thing, and none of them have actually looked at the ground or the cattle closely enough to know what the right thing actually is." He paused. "I'd rather have one person giving me clear direction, even if that's harder to find." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them cast a warm light that softened the angles of his face. "And you think I'm giving you clear direction," she said. "The clearest I've had in years," he said simply, and she looked down at her coffee. The trouble with Clarence Hadley arrived on a Thursday, which was the beginning of the second week of Amos's time on the Slater ranch. Gertrude had ridden out to check on the cattle that morning, and found 3 of Hadley's steers mixed in with her herd near the gap in the eastern pasture fence, where she had a temporary wooden gate that wasn't quite as secure as it should be. She rode around her herd, counted carefully, and determined that none of her own cattle had gotten out in exchange, which was a small relief. But the presence of Hadley's steers was a problem because it gave him grounds to come onto her property. And Clarence Hadley finding reasons to come onto her property was never a comfortable situation. She was riding Hadley's steers back toward the gate when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Amos coming up at a trot on the roan. "I saw you heading this way and thought you might want company," he said, drawing up beside her. She opened her mouth to tell him she was perfectly capable of handling this herself, and then she stopped. Because she was capable of handling it herself, and she had been handling it herself for 3 years, and the truth was that having someone else present when Hadley came to collect his steers was not a bad idea strategically. Hadley was not a violent man, but he was a pushing man, the kind who tested for weakness and exploited whatever he found, and having a witness had its uses. "Fine," she said, "but let me do the talking." "Understood," he said. Hadley arrived 40 minutes later with 2 of his ranch hands, a red-faced man who ran to bluster, wearing a hat that cost more than his manners were worth. He rode up to the gate where Gertrude was waiting with his 3 steers penned in the corner, and he looked at the steers and then at Gertrude and then, with visible recalibration, at Amos. "Slater," he said, "I see you've got some of my livestock." "I found them in my east pasture this morning," she said. "Your gate on the Comanche Creek Road must be down." "That gate was fine last I checked," Hadley said, his eyes moving to Amos again. "Who's this?" "A hired hand," Gertrude said. "You want your steers, Mr. Hadley, they're right there. Your men can take them." Hadley did not move to direct his men. He was looking at the fence line stretching away to the west, the newly set posts gleaming with fresh work, the wire catching the morning sun. His expression did something complicated that she had learned to read as calculation. "I hear you've been having trouble with your western fence line," he said. "It's repaired now," she said. "I'd heard you were struggling to find good help." He said it pleasantly, which was the way Hadley said unpleasant things. "Thought maybe we could revisit that conversation about the purchase price for the Western 40. I know you've been stretched thin since your father passed. No shame in it." "I'm not stretched thin, and my land is not for sale," she said. "Not at any price, and not to you specifically." Hadley's eyes slid to Amos again, assessing. Amos sat his horse with a relaxed, unhurried stillness that was somehow more imposing than if he'd sat up straight and stiffened his jaw. "That's a real shame," Hadley said, and the pleasantness in his voice curdled a little. "A woman alone out here running a spread this size, it's a hard life." "I manage," Gertrude said. "Take your steers, Mr. Hadley." There was a long pause. Hadley looked at her, and then at Amos, who had not said a single word throughout the entire exchange and had not needed to. There was something about the quality of his silence, the way he was simply present and attentive and completely untroubled, that communicated its own message. Hadley signaled his men, who came forward and drove the 3 steers back through the gate. Then Hadley touched his hat brim, the way you touched your hat when you weren't entirely sure if the gesture was required and wanted to hedge your bets, and rode away. When they were gone, Gertrude let out a long, controlled breath. "He's been after the land for a while," she said. "I can see that," Amos said. He hadn't turned to watch Hadley go. He was watching her. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out with some effort. "For coming out. It was useful to have someone here. He strikes me as a man who does more when he thinks no one is watching," he said. "That is an accurate assessment," she said. "We'll need to fix that east gate before anything else." "Tell me what you want done with it," he said, and turned his horse toward the barn. She watched him go and told herself firmly that gratitude was a reasonable emotion and did not mean anything beyond itself. The east gate was repaired by afternoon. The fence line was completed by the end of the following Monday. When Gertrude walked the entire western boundary that evening to inspect the work, she found it as good as anything she had ever seen, the posts plumb and solid, the wire strung at the right tension, the gravel-laid sections near the creek looking exactly the way she had specified. She came back to the house to find Amos at the pump, washing the day off his hands, and she said, without qualifying it, "The fence is excellent." He straightened up and looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I'm going to need to move the herd back to the western pasture tomorrow. It'll go faster with two. After that, the fence work is done." She paused. "I have some other things that need doing. The bunkhouse roof is starting to give, and I have about 60 feet of irrigation ditch that needs cleaning out along the south field. If you want to stay on for another week or two, I can keep paying you the same rate." He considered this with that unhurried way he had of considering things. "I'll stay," he said. She told herself this was practical and went inside to start supper. Moving the herd the next morning was a study in the quiet coordination that had somehow developed between them over the preceding 2 weeks. They moved the cattle through the repaired gate without losing a single animal, Amos reading the herd's movements and positioning himself where she needed him to be before she had to tell him, which was a thing that ranch hands could go years without learning to do, and some never managed at all. After the cattle were settled in the western pasture, she reined up her horse beside his and they both sat for a moment looking at the herd spreading out across the good grass, their movements easy and unhurried, and it was one of those rare quiet moments that seemed to belong to a different kind of time than the rest of the day. "You know cattle," she said. "Spent enough years around them," he said. "You were a real cowboy out on the drives." He smiled at the word real, a quiet smile that suggested a private amusement. "I went up the Western Trail twice with a big outfit out of Texas, 76 and 77, before I settled in Wyoming." He paused. "It's good work when you're young enough to think sleeping on the ground for 3 months is romantic, less good when you're older." "How old are you?" she asked, and then felt a flash of annoyance at herself for asking it quite so directly. 31, he said. "You, 26, she said, "and I wasn't about to ask you not to ask." This time the smile spread further and stayed longer. "I didn't think you were," he said. They rode back to the barn together without saying anything else, and the silence was comfortable in a way she was beginning to recognize as specific to his company. The bunkhouse roof occupied them for 2 days, which involved more comedy than she had anticipated. The roof was a simple shed-style construction, and the problem was a section of shingles on the northwest corner that had started to curl and pull away from the decking. This should have been straightforward. What made it less than straightforward was the ladder situation. She had one ladder, a 14-foot wooden one with a cracked rung at the 9-foot mark that she had been meaning to replace for 2 seasons. "Don't put your weight on the 9th rung," she told him as he started up. "Which one is the 9th? Count from the bottom." He counted, put his foot carefully to the side of the 9th rung rather than the center and continued up. She was watching from below, one hand on the ladder's base to steady it, and she was aware that she was watching with a level of attention that was not entirely structural in its concern. He got the roof repaired in 2 days. He replaced the cracked ladder rung on the second afternoon without being asked, using a cedar board she had in the barn and a couple of square-cut nails, and when she found it, she stood looking at it for a moment before she said, "Thank you," and he said, "It was a hazard," and that was the whole conversation. The irrigation ditch was the most unpleasant job because it involved wading into knee-deep mud and moving accumulated silt by hand and with a long-handled spade. They worked from opposite ends toward the middle, and when they met in the center, both of them were covered to the thigh in black river mud, and the day was hot enough to make her eyes ache. She looked at him standing in the ditch beside her, mud-covered, sweating, and apparently undisturbed by any of it, and something shifted in her chest that she did not have a word for. "You are not what I expected when I hired you," she said. He looked at her. "What did you expect? A man who would do the work adequately and spend the rest of his time trying to tell me how to manage my own land," she said. "Or one who would do the work badly and spend the rest of his time defending why?" "Ah," he said. "I've had both kinds," she said. "The last hand I hired before you lasted 11 days before he told me that I was managing the herd wrong and offered to show me the right way. I sent him off that afternoon." "What was he doing wrong?" Amos asked, and the question amused her because he had assumed, correctly, that the problem was with the hand and not with her. "He was grazing them in the wrong rotation for this particular pasture layout," she said. The eastern pasture has a boggy section near the north fence. If you rotate the herd through there too late in the season, the ground is still soft and they damage the grass roots. You have to run them through in late April before the real heat, when the ground is dry enough to take the traffic. She paused. He wanted to run them through in July. That would have been a mess, Amos said. It would have been a significant mess, she agreed. Now, shall we get out of this ditch before the mud sets? He looked down at the state of himself and then up at her, and he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. A full, genuine laugh that was warm and a little rough. The laugh of a man who did not laugh as a performance, but laughed when something genuinely struck him as funny, which in this case was apparently the two of them standing knee-deep in a Kansas irrigation ditch, looking like a pair of river monsters. She laughed too, and the sound of it surprised her slightly because it came up freely, and without any of the self-consciousness she usually applied to herself in the company of men. They climbed out of the ditch and used the pump behind the barn to clean up as well as they could manage, and she was very busy concentrating on her own arms and not paying any attention to the fact that he had to roll his shirt sleeves up to his elbows to get the mud off, and his arms were tan from working in the sun, and there were veins along his forearms that suggested the kind of effortless strength that she concentrated on her arms. That night at supper, she made pan-fried chicken with gravy and fried potatoes, because it was Friday, and she cooked a better supper on Fridays out of a habit she had never entirely examined. He ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had spent years eating trail food and was not inclined to take a good meal lightly, and afterward he helped her clear the plates to the wash basin, which no hired hand she had ever employed had done, and she did not say anything about it. They sat on the porch after supper because the evening was nice, the heat letting up a little as the sun went down behind the bluestem grass, the sky going that particular shade of deep Kansas gold. She had a rocker and he sat on the porch steps, his back against the post, and they listened to the sound of the crickets starting up. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said, which was her standard answer to that question. It did not commit her to answering. "Why do you stay here?" he said. "I don't mean it as a criticism. I'm genuinely curious. It's hard country for anyone. It's harder for a woman on her own. You could sell this place for a decent price, enough to live on for years if you were careful, and go somewhere easier." She rocked once slowly. "My father built this house," she said. "My mother's kitchen garden is still growing along the south wall. The first calf I ever pulled myself is one of my breeding cows now. She's the one with the notch in her left ear. Every inch of this land has something on it that I put there or that my family put there. And it's mine outright. Nobody can take it from me unless I let them." She paused. "I have no use for Easy. Easy doesn't produce anything that feels worth having." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose it doesn't. Why do you keep moving?" she asked. "From Kentucky to Wyoming to Colorado to wherever the next place is." He looked out at the darkening pasture. "I've been trying to find a place that felt like it was worth staying," he said. "I haven't found it yet." She didn't respond to that. She rocked once more and looked at the stars coming out above the bluestem. He left for the bunkhouse about an hour later, and she sat alone on the porch for a while thinking about things that she told herself she was not thinking about. The next morning Amos mentioned, while they were doing the morning feeding, that he had spotted a broken section of the south pasture fence the previous afternoon when he'd been coming back from the irrigation ditch. Not serious damage, just two posts that had gone soft in the ground and were leaning toward each other like a pair of tired men. She went to look at it that afternoon and found he was right. They were easy enough to fix, but while they were working on the second post, she noticed something that made her stop. Across the property line, maybe 100 yards into Hadley's land, there was fresh evidence of cattle movement through a section of brush that had always served as a natural barrier between their properties. The brush had been pushed through, not by cattle moving naturally, but by something more deliberate, and there were boot prints in the soft ground at the edge of it that were not hers. She said nothing to Amos while they finished the fence post. But after supper that night, she got out the survey map her father had filed in the county records and spread it on the kitchen table. Amos was on the porch. She called him in. He came and stood beside her at the table, and she showed him the map, pointing out the property boundaries, the creek line, the location of the brush section she had found. "Hadley has been moving through that brush," she said. "I don't know why yet, but I don't think it's innocent." Amos studied the map. He traced the creek line with his finger, following it from where it ran along her western fence to where it curved south into Hadley's land. "There's a good spring up here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map where a notation indicated a water source. "On your land." "My father's spring," she said. "Best water source on either property. Hadley has been trying to get access to it for years. That's why he wants the western 40. If he's been cutting through the brush to your south pasture, he might be planning to claim the path as an established right-of-way," Amos said slowly. "If he can show regular travel through your land, he can petition for a legal easement." She stared at him. "That is exactly the kind of scheme Clarence Hadley would devise," she said. "How do you know about easement law?" "I spent 2 years in Colorado working for a lawyer who was building a ranch on the side," he said. "You pick things up." She looked at the map. "I need to document this," she said, "and I need to block that passage." "I can build a fence along the south boundary of the brush section tomorrow," he said. "It's within your property line. That would eliminate the path and give you something physical to point to." "Yes," she said. "Do that." She paused. "Thank you for seeing it and telling me." He looked at her, and something in his expression was gentle in a way that was not soft. "You'd have figured it out yourself," he said. "I just happened to walk past it first." "Maybe," she said. "But you told me." The fence along the south brush was built in a single long day, the two of them working without stopping except for a brief midday meal taken sitting in the shade of the wagon again. By the time the sun was getting low, the passage was closed. 3 days later, Clarence Hadley rode up to the main gate with his lawyer, a thin, pale man from Dodge named Whitmore, and asked to speak with Gertrude. She met them at the gate. Amos was visible in the background, mending a piece of harness on the fence rail, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present. Hadley's lawyer produced a document that claimed a right-of-way through the Slater South pasture based on established use. He presented it with the smooth confidence of a man who expected it to land heavily. Gertrude looked at the document. Then she looked at Hadley. Then she said, "That fence went up 8 days ago. Before that fence went up, that brush section was undisturbed for as long as I can show. I have witnesses who will attest that the passage you're claiming shows evidence of very recent and very deliberate interference. I also have the county survey records that clearly mark this property boundary, and I have the dates of my irrigation work in the south field which demonstrate that I have been maintaining active use of that land all season." She handed the document back to the lawyer. "File your petition if you want, but I will contest it in the county court in Caldwell, and I will win, and the judge in Caldwell has known my family for 20 years. The lawyer looked at Hadley. Hadley's face had gone a mottled color that was not healthy. "Mrs. Slater," Hadley started. "Miss Slater," she said. "Miss Slater, there's no reason we need to be adversaries here. I've made you a fair offer." "You've made me an insulting offer for land that is worth considerably more and that I have no intention of selling," she said. "We are done here, Mr. Hadley. I would like you to leave my property." Hadley looked past her at Amos, who had set down the harness piece and was standing with the kind of quiet watchfulness that was more effective than any aggressive posture. Hadley left. The lawyer left. She stood at the gate watching the dust of their horses settle, and when she turned around, Amos was there. "He'll try something else," he said. "He always does," she said. "But I have the law on my side and he knows it. He's a bully, not a criminal. He'll push until he runs into something that pushes back, and then he'll eventually move on to a softer target." She paused. "You helped me think through the easement thing in time to stop it. You would have caught it yourself." "Stop saying that," she said, not unkindly. "Let me give you credit." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "You're welcome." She almost smiled. She turned back toward the house instead. That evening the rain came in hard from the northwest, the kind of summer storm that arrives with the seriousness of a much larger event, and they were both outside when it started, she checking on the cattle and he at the barn. She was halfway across the yard when the first real sheet of rain came down, and she was immediately soaked to the skin. She made it to the barn at a run, and he was there, pulling the door closed behind her, and they stood in the amber dimness of the barn with the rain hammering on the roof and the smell of hay and horses thick and warm around them, both of them dripping. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a particular quality to the moment that she recognized and did not move away from. "Your bunkhouse roof," she said. "It'll hold," he said. "I fixed it properly." "I know you did," she said. The rain went on. One of the horses shifted in its stall. She crossed her arms against the chill of her wet clothes and watched the rain come through the gap at the bottom of the barn door, running in a thin, bright stream across the dirt floor. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How much longer were you planning to stay?" He was quiet. "I wasn't planning," he said. "I was waiting." "For what?" "I wasn't sure," he said. "I think I was waiting to see whether this felt like the place worth staying I mentioned." She looked at him then, directly, in the way that she rarely looked at anyone because it was a kind of exposure she didn't practice. And he said, and his voice was quieter now, "I think it does. Or rather, I think you do." She felt the words go through her like the first warm air in April, the kind that comes through after a long winter and finds you unprepared for how much you needed it. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about how I am." "All right," he said. "I don't do well with men who think they know better than I do how to run my own life," she said. "I have tried that once when I was younger, and it was a miserable experience that I have no intention of repeating. I am not an easy person to be around. I have strong opinions, and I am particular about how things are done, and I do not bend on things that matter to me. I have been told by more than one person that these qualities make me difficult." "Who told you that?" he said, and his voice was gentle, but there was something in it that was not quite gentle. "My former fiancé, mostly," she said, "and various townspeople who think a woman ought to be more accommodating." "Your former fiancé," he said carefully, "sounds like a man who wanted something other than what you are." "He wanted a woman who would do as she was told and be grateful for it," she said. "I told him I had no use for a man who couldn't take direction, and he said he wasn't interested in taking direction from a woman, and that was that." Amos was very still. The rain on the roof was steady and loud. "I told him I had no use for a man who couldn't take direction," she said again, more quietly. "And the truth is, I meant it. I still mean it. I don't need someone to make my decisions. I don't need someone to manage this place. I need someone who can work beside me, who can hear what I'm saying and respond to it honestly, who can disagree with me when they have a real reason to disagree without making it about who has the authority." She looked at him. "I don't know that many men like that." "I know," he said quietly. "They're not common." "Are you one?" she asked. The question came out more direct than she had intended, but she found she did not want to take it back. He looked at her for a long moment. "I said I was listening already," he said, "when you told me your conditions on those hotel steps, and I meant it, not because I thought it was what you wanted to hear, because it was true." He paused. "You said what you needed. You were clear about it. That seemed reasonable. It still seems reasonable." "You didn't know me then," she said. "No," he said, "but I knew the kind of person who talks that way, direct, no apology for it. I didn't meet many people in Wyoming or Colorado who talked that way either, men or women." The rain was easing slightly, the hard initial force of it giving way to a steadier, gentler sound. "I'm not asking you to stay permanently," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you things about myself because they seem relevant." "They're relevant," he agreed. "Can I tell you some things about myself?" "Yes," she said. "I'm a patient man," he said. "I have been accused of being too patient, of waiting so long to say a thing that the moment passes. I'm trying not to do that right now." He paused, and she saw something careful in his face, something that was managing its own hope. I'm telling you that whatever this is, whatever has been building in the last 3 weeks while we've been fighting creek mud and Clarence Hadley and cracked ladder rungs, I don't want to leave it behind when I leave this place, if I leave this place." Her heart was doing something that she wished it wouldn't do quite so loudly. "I'm not a simple woman," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for simple." The rain came down. The horses were quiet. The barn smelled of hay and wood and the particular green smell of a summer storm, and Gertrude Slater stood looking at Amos Sullivan and felt the thing she had been trying not to feel for 3 weeks move through her with the unstoppable quality of creek water after a hard rain. "You'd better not make me regret this," she said. He took one step closer, and she did not take a step back. "I'm listening," he said very quietly. "Tell me what you need." She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and felt the slight rough warmth of a day's growth of beard under her palm, and the steadiness of him, the realness of him, and he covered her hand with his and held it there, and looked at her with an expression that was open and clear and completely without performance. She kissed him. Gently at first and then not gently, and the rain went on, and neither of them was in any hurry. When she pulled back, they looked at each other in the amber lamplight, and she felt something settle inside her that had been a long time in the settling. "I cook better than you do," she said. He laughed, that warm, rough laugh. "Yes," he said. "You do, and I know this land better than you do." "Yes," he said, "you do, and my way with the fence posts is better," he smiled. "On the creek-adjacent sections, absolutely," he said. "The Wyoming three-strand held up fine for 3 years." She narrowed her eyes. He was still smiling. "We can revisit the wire spacing discussion another time," she said. "I'll be looking forward to it," he said. She went back to the house in the rain, and he went to the bunkhouse, and she sat at her kitchen table with her wet hair loose and her hands around a warm cup of coffee, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that she identified quietly and carefully as happiness. She was extremely suspicious of it, but it was there. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them, though nothing visible changed, and she was deliberate about keeping it that way while she was still determining what she trusted. Amos worked. She worked. They were together through the long working days and the evenings, and they talked more than they had in the first weeks, real talking, the kind where you stop holding back the parts of yourself that seem too certain or too particular. She told him about her father, a quiet, methodical man from Ohio who had come west in 1859 and spent 20 years building the Slater Ranch into what it was. About the way he had taught her to read a field and a sky and a cow, about how he had never treated the land as something to be managed, but as something to be understood. About the winter he died, which had been hard in a way that the cold and the work were not responsible for. He told her about his family in Kentucky, a large family, 5 brothers and a mother who ran the farm while their father worked the coal and came home black with it every evening. About how he had left at 18, not because he was unhappy, but because the West called to him the way certain things call to certain people, in a voice that doesn't give you much choice about whether you listen. About the years on the trail, the friendships made with other young men driving cattle north under skies so enormous they made you feel small but not badly so. She told him she had been engaged at 22, a man from Dodge named Robert who had seemed fine in the abstract, and revealed himself in the specific to be someone who expected the world to arrange itself around his comfort. She told this story flatly and without self-pity, as though it were simply one of the things that had happened. He told her he had loved someone once, in Wyoming, a woman named Clara who had married a rancher with more land and better prospects, which he said without bitterness, only with the kind of understanding that time applied to things that had been painful when they were new. One Sunday afternoon they rode out together to look at the spring, the good spring that Hadley coveted. It was a beautiful thing, tucked in a hollow on the western rise of her land, surrounded by cottonwood trees that were thick and green in the August heat, the water coming up clear and cold from somewhere deep underground and running in a little channel toward the creek. They let the horses drink and stood beside them in the shade of the cottonwoods, listening to the water move. "I see why he wants it," Amos said. "It's not for wanting," she said. "It's mine." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was warm and amused and admiring all at once. "Yes, it is," he said. They sat under the cottonwoods for a while, which was a luxury because the days were full and the work did not stop for pleasant weather. She had brought apples from the basket in the kitchen, good Kansas apples that were tart and hard, and they ate them and listened to the water and the horses and the wind in the cottonwood leaves. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, looking at the water. "I think I would like to stay," he said, "not as a hired hand, as someone with a reason to be here that isn't a wage." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the same level, unhurried attention she had first noticed on the hotel steps in Caldwell, but there was more in it now, everything that 3 weeks of honest company had added to it. "I am not a simple situation," she said again, because she needed him to understand it clearly. "Gertrude," he said, "I know that's not a deterrent." She was quiet for a moment. The water ran. An apple core fell in the grass. One of the horses sighed. "What would staying look like to you?" she asked. "Specifically, I need to know what you're actually saying." He thought about it with the care he gave to things. "I would like to help you build this ranch into what it can be," he said. "I would like to spend my evenings arguing with you about fence wire and pasture rotation, and anything else you have a strong opinion about, which I expect will be a long and comprehensive list. I would like to be someone you trust, not to make decisions for you, but to make decisions with you when you want that." He paused. "I would like to marry you eventually if you decide you want that, but I'm not putting that in front of the other things. The other things come first and matter more." She looked at him for a long time. She was looking for the places where this was not what it appeared to be, because she had learned to look for those places and they were usually there. She looked for performance and found none. She looked for calculation and found none. She found instead a man sitting under a cottonwood tree beside a clear spring on a summer afternoon, looking at her with plain honesty, patient as stone. "Ask me again about the marrying part in a few months," she said. "But the rest of it." "Yes, I want that." His exhale was slow and quiet and contained in it something that was pure relief. He did not throw his arms around her, which was correct. He put his hand over hers in the grass and held it, and she turned her hand palm up and held his back, and they sat like that while the horses drank and the water ran and the cottonwood leaves turned in the good afternoon wind. He stayed. The fall came on like it always did in Kansas, the air going sharp and clear, the bluestem going bronze, the cattle fattening on the fall grass. Amos proved to be exactly what he had represented himself as, which was in itself a thing worth noting because the world was full of men who presented well and delivered poorly. He had knowledge she did not have, specifically about the physical work of large-scale cattle management, the techniques from the bigger Wyoming operations that were efficient and practical even on a smaller spread. He shared this knowledge the way he shared everything, as information offered rather than instruction delivered, and when she questioned it or wanted to do something differently, he listened to her reasoning and either accepted it or made his case clearly and without resentment. She found him one October morning on his knees beside the Southfield irrigation channel, making a small modification to the water flow that she had not asked him to make. She stopped and looked at it. It was a good modification, one that would reduce the silt accumulation that required them to clean the channel every season. "What made you think of that?" she asked. "The way the water was flowing after the last rain," he said. "I should have asked you before I started. I'm sorry." She considered this. "It's a good change," she said. "But yes, next time ask." "Yes," he said. "Not because I need to approve everything," she said, "but because it's my land and I want to know what's happening on it." "That's reasonable," he said. "I understand. I won't do it again without asking." And he didn't. October deepened. The cattle were doing well, her numbers healthy, and Hadley had been quiet since the easement attempt, which she attributed partly to the fact that she had spoken to the county judge on a visit to Caldwell and briefly outlined the situation. and the judge had not been impressed by Hadley's maneuvers. It was not a legal proceeding, just a conversation, but Hadley had heard about it, as these things were heard about in small towns, and he had apparently decided to take his expansion plans in a different direction. She and Amos rode into Caldwell together on a Saturday in late October for supplies, which was the first time she had appeared in town with him in any context that was not purely practical. She was aware of the looks they received, the quick assessments of the women outside the dry goods store, the more deliberate acknowledgments of the men along the boardwalk. Small towns in 1882 did not miss much. She did not explain herself to anyone. She bought her supplies and he carried the heavier bags to the wagon, and they stopped at the diner for a meal before the ride back, sitting across from each other at a small table while the proprietress, a friendly woman named Ellen Marsh, brought them coffee and beef pie. Ellen set down the coffee and looked between them with the bright, direct expression of a woman who had decided to simply say what she thought. "Well, it's about time someone kept up with Gertrude Slater," she said cheerfully. "Lord knows we've all been taking bets on whether the right person would come along." Gertrude set her coffee cup down. "Ellen," she said. "I mean it kindly," Ellen said, already retreating toward the kitchen. Amos looked at Gertrude across the table with that expression that held amusement and something warmer. "We've been taking bets," he repeated softly. "Do not encourage her," Gertrude said. "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. They ate their beef pie. Under the table his boot found hers accidentally and then not accidentally, and she did not move her foot away. November came and the first cold snap arrived, and he moved from the bunkhouse to the house on a Tuesday evening when the temperature dropped to 12 degrees, and the bunkhouse stove was not equal to the task. She had the spare bedroom that had been her father's, and she showed him into it with the brisk practicality that was her preferred mode for things she cared about more than she wanted to show, and he said thank you and asked if he could help bank the main fireplace for the night. They worked side by side in the fireplace glow, banking the coals, their shoulders close, and afterward he stood up and looked at her in the warm light. "Gertrude," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. He kissed her with a great deal of care and no hurry, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back without the need to manage it or hold any of it in reserve. December was cold and close, and there was a blizzard the week before Christmas that kept them inside for 3 days, working through her father's old account books together, going through the records she had been meaning to organize for 2 years, talking and working, and occasionally not talking at all in the easy silence that had become natural between them. She asked him to stay for Christmas, and he stayed, and they had a simple Christmas, a roasted chicken and good potatoes and a small bottle of brandy she had been saving, and they sat by the fire and he read to her from a novel she had been meaning to read for a year, and she fell asleep in the rocking chair listening to his voice, and when she woke he had covered her with a blanket and built the fire up and was sitting across from her reading quietly to himself, and that, she thought, looking at him without his knowing she was looking, was possibly the most content she had ever been in her life. January brought hard work and cold that settled in with the permanence of a deciding opinion. They were busy with the cattle, the winter feeding, checking the fence lines against snow weight, keeping the water sources open. It was not romantic work in any dramatic sense, but it was the work of 2 people who had learned each other thoroughly and moved through their shared days with a competence and ease that was its own kind of beautiful. He proposed to her on a clear January morning while they were fixing the pump handle in the barnyard, both of them cold-nosed, their breath making clouds in the air, and she had not seen it coming in that particular moment, which was unusual for her because she generally saw things coming. He had the ring in his coat pocket. He had been to Caldwell the previous week on an errand she had not inquired into. He pulled his glove off and produced the ring, which was a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the winter light, and he said, "I asked you to tell me when. I think it's when." She looked at the ring and then at him, This man who had come off hotel steps 4 months prior and become the most important person in her daily life with a thoroughness that she still found slightly astonishing. "You said you wanted to marry me eventually," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you've waited." "Yes," he said, "and you're asking now." "Yes," he said. "Though I'd like you to tell me what you need before I put that ring on your finger, because some things might be different when it's not a wage agreement." She looked at him steadily. "Nothing is different," she said. "This is still my land. My decisions are still my decisions. You are still a person whose opinion I value, whose help I want, and whose company I do not intend to give up. But nothing about the management of this place changes because there's a ring involved." "Understood," he said. "I wouldn't want it any other way." "We will be partners," she said. "Not in the legal sense necessarily, the land stays in my name, but in the actual sense. What affects this place affects both of us, and we decide together, and when we disagree, we work through it." "Yes," he said. "And you will not tell me how to run my cattle or my fence lines without being asked, and when I ask you, you will tell me the truth even if you think I won't want to hear it." "Yes," he said. "Gertrude, I have been telling you the truth since the day I met you. I'm not planning to stop." She believed him. This was not a thing she had believed about many people in her life, but she believed it about him. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that were warm even in the January cold, and she looked at it on her hand, the small garnet bright against the winter morning, and then she looked at him, and he was smiling at her, that full, warm smile that still surprised her a little every time she saw it. She kissed him there in the barnyard in the cold, while the horses looked on from the fence with their usual philosophical patience. And it was nothing like the dramatic proposals she had read about in novels. No moonlight or speeches. Just two people in a barnyard in Kansas in January, committed to each other with the straightforward certainty of people who have already tested their ability to work together in the mud. It was, she thought, exactly right. They were married in March in the Caldwell Church, which was a small whitewashed building on the north end of town, with a bell that needed ringing, and a pastor named Reverend Albright who had known Gertrude's father and seemed genuinely pleased about the occasion. It was not a large wedding. Ellen Marsh was there, and old Pete Granville who had shod Amos's horse and therefore had an indirect claim to credit, and a few of the neighboring ranch families who she had good relations with, and a woman named Dorothy Haynes who had been her mother's closest friend, and who cried with considerable enthusiasm throughout the ceremony. Amos had written to his family in Kentucky and received back a warm letter from his mother that Gertrude read with a funny tightness in her chest, because it was the kind of letter a good mother wrote to welcome a new daughter, full of small kindnesses and genuine welcome, and an expressed desire to come west and visit when the seasons permitted. She wrote back immediately, and with more warmth than she had expected to find in herself. The ceremony was simple and it was real, and at the end of it she stood in the March sun outside the church with her husband's hand in hers, and felt the earth solid beneath her feet. Spring came with its particular ferocity, the rains arriving hard and the creek running high, and the western fence line held. Every post held. The gravel and post setting that she had specified and that Amos had learned held perfectly through a spring that was harder than the previous years. She went out the morning after the biggest flood pulse to walk the line, and she found it solid, every post plumb, not a yard of wire displaced. She came back to the house where he was making breakfast, a thing he had taken to doing several mornings a week with increasing competence, having learned from her, and then applied what he learned with the same focused patience he applied to everything. The fence held, she said. He looked up from the stove. All of it, every post, she said, every inch of wire, he smiled. Good gravel work, he said. Good posts, she said. I picked them. You did, he said. She sat down at the kitchen table, and he put a plate of eggs and cornbread in front of her, and sat down across from her with his own plate, and they ate breakfast in the March morning with the creek running high outside, and the bluestem beginning to come up green and the cattle moving in the eastern pasture. and it was a good morning of a good life. By the summer of 1883, they had added 8 more cattle to the herd through a careful spring purchase that Amos had researched and she had approved, bringing her total to 31 head. The South Field irrigation system was running better than it ever had. The farmhouse had a new section of roof that they had built together over 2 weekends, a genuine collaboration that had involved exactly the level of constructive disagreement she had come to expect from their working partnership, which was to say a great deal of clear-headed discussion, and the eventual arrival at a decision that was better than either of them would have made alone. In August, Gertrude told Amos over breakfast that she was pregnant. He was absolutely still for a moment, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. "How are you feeling?" was the first thing he said. "Surprised," she said, "and well, I've been feeling well." "When?" "March, I think, late March or early April." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him have it, and they sat like that for a while in the summer morning. "I need you to understand," she said, "that I intend to keep working until I cannot, and to start again as soon as I can after." "I know," he said. "I would not suggest otherwise. And the decisions about how this happens are mine to make with the doctor's guidance, not yours." "I know," he said again. "I'm here for whatever you need. Tell me what that is and I'll do it." She looked at him. "I need you to keep doing what you're doing," she said, "and to not treat me like something fragile." "You are not fragile," he said. "I have never thought you were." She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank that evening, a mixed bunch of prairie flowers that he had cut with his pocket knife and arranged with more care than he probably wanted to admit to, and she put them in a tin cup on the kitchen table and looked at them and felt the particular softness that she was still learning not to hide from him. "Thank you," she said. "They're from your land," he said. "Ours," she said quietly, and watched something light up in his face. The autumn was a busy one, the fall cattle management made more complex by her increasing inability to do certain physical things without discomfort, which she managed with her characteristic practicality and a minimum of complaint. Amos took on more of the heavy work without commentary, which was the correct approach, and she told him so. He hired a young man from town named Billy Cross for the month of October to help with the fall roundup, a willing if inexperienced hand who worked hard and learned fast. Dorothy Haynes came to stay in November as the due date approached, and she and Gertrude occupied the kitchen with a shared purposefulness that excluded men entirely, and neither woman had to discuss this because it was simply understood. Amos found useful tasks in the barn and kept himself there with a patience that she noted and appreciated. Their son was born on a cold night in late November, healthy and loud, and thoroughly of the opinion that the world should know he had arrived. They named him Thomas for her father, and she held him in the firelight while Amos sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was completely unguarded, open with a kind of wondering that was the same quality she had first noticed in him on the hotel steps, but turned toward something new. Thomas Slater Sullivan came into the world in a Kansas farmhouse that had good solid fences and a clear spring and a south field that irrigated itself well, and he was not going to want for anything that 2 capable, steady, devoted people could provide for him. Dorothy stayed for 2 weeks and then went home to Caldwell, satisfied that everything was in order. Amos took on the running of the ranch entirely through December and January, and she directed operations from the kitchen and the rocking chair and the occasional purposeful walk outside when the weather permitted and her body cooperated, and he carried out her direction without argument and reported back to her honestly, and they managed together as they did everything else, which was to say well. Thomas was an easy baby, or at least he became one after the first month, sleeping in a wooden cradle that Amos had built during the late pregnancy from walnut boards he had bought in Caldwell, a piece of work that was better than anything she had expected, and that she told him so. "I watched a man build one in Wyoming," he said. "I remembered how he did it. "You remember everything," she said. "I remember what's worth remembering," he said, looking at her, and she found herself looking away because even after everything, the direct warmth of his attention still did something to her equilibrium that she found she did not want to entirely control. By the spring of 1884, Thomas was 4 months old and the ranch was moving into its second year under their partnership, and things were good. Not perfect, because Kansas in the 1880s was not a perfect place for anyone, and the work was hard and the winters were real and Clarence Hadley would never be a friendly neighbor. But good. Solidly, genuinely good. Gertrude was back at full strength by April, working the spring roundup beside Amos with Thomas strapped to her back in a carrier that Dorothy Haynes had taught her to make from a length of strong cotton, which Thomas regarded as a fine arrangement, and went asleep in regularly regardless of what was happening around him. The spring fence walk found the western line perfect again through another high-water spring. The cattle were healthy, the new calves were strong, the south field was coming in well. Billy Cross came back for the spring work, a reliable young man now with some experience under his belt and a decent hand with cattle. One evening in May, Gertrude and Amos sat on the porch as they so often did, the rocker for her and the porch steps for him, Thomas asleep inside in his cradle with the window open so she could hear him. The spring evening was mild and green, and the bluestem was coming up strong. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "The day I hired you," she said. "On the hotel steps, you were reading a newspaper." "I remember," he said. "I almost didn't come back," she said. "I went to the hardware store and the feed store first and asked around. Mabel Doris told me about the man at the hotel who'd been there 4 days and wasn't in a hurry." "That sounds like me," he said. "I almost hired someone else," she said. "There was a man at the livery who wanted work, but he had the look of someone who was going to tell me how to do things from the first morning. What made you decide against him?" "He called me dear when I spoke to him," she said, "before I'd said 3 sentences. Amos made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That would do it," he said. "And you," she said, "when I gave you all my conditions on those hotel steps, you said you were listening already. Not that you would try, not that you understood, you said you were already listening." "Because I was," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I hired you." He turned to look up at her from the porch step, his face caught in the last of the evening light, and she saw in it everything she knew about him, the patience and the honesty and the steady attentiveness that was still, even now, the most characteristic thing about him. "I should tell you something," he said. "I've been meaning to say it for a while." "Then say it," she said. "The day you came up to me on those steps," he said slowly, "I had been sitting there for 4 days trying to decide whether to go on to Dodge or go back east or stay. I was not actually waiting for work. I was trying to figure out what I wanted. And then you came and stood in front of me with a list of requirements and a set of conditions and a look in your eye that said you meant every word, and I thought—" He paused. "I thought, there is someone who knows what she wants and is not embarrassed about it. And I was tired of people who didn't know what they wanted and weren't honest about what they were doing." She was very still. "I was listening already," he said, "because you were the first person in a long time who was saying something worth listening to." She looked at him for a long time in the May evening, this man who had come off hotel steps by accident and then never quite left, who had set her fence posts 4 feet deep and strung her wire at the right tension, and defended her land from Clarence Hadley's maneuvers and built a walnut cradle and watched the spring water with her under the cottonwood trees, who said what he meant and meant what he said and was, impossibly, exactly who she needed him to be. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad I hired you," she said. He smiled, warm and full, the smile she had seen 100 times now and still felt in the center of her chest. "So am I," he said. Thomas made a small sound from inside the house, a half-awake murmur, and she tilted her head to listen, and it subsided back into sleep. The crickets were starting up in the pasture. Somewhere south, a coyote called once and was quiet. She reached down from the rocking chair and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat in the spring evening with the land around them that was hers and his and Thomas's, and the spring that ran clear from deep underground, and the fence that held against the water, and all the life they were building together, piece by careful piece, in a corner of Kansas in the last honest years of the frontier. Two people who had found in each other the particular and irreplaceable thing they had both been looking for. There was nothing left open between them, nothing unresolved. There were difficult winters ahead and hard work, and the ordinary grief and joy of a life lived fully and without pretense, but none of that was unknown to either of them, and they would face it the way they faced everything, side by side, honest, listening. 2 years on, the spring of 1886 found the Slater ranch in its best shape ever. Gertrude had expanded the herd to 40 head, a number she had set as her target and achieved through careful selective breeding and 2 good years of Kansas rain. Amos had become, in the minds of the Caldwell community, as much a part of the place as Gertrude herself, not because he had taken it over, but because he had become genuinely embedded in it, known for his steadiness and his fair dealing, and for being the kind of man who was standing next to Gertrude Slater in all the ways that mattered. Thomas, at 2.5, was a lively, curious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's unhurried way of looking at things before he acted on them, and he followed them both around the ranch with the focused interest of someone who was learning everything and filing it away. Gertrude was already teaching him the names of the cattle, and he had opinions about which ones he liked best, and his opinion was generally respected. Their second child, a boy again, arrived in the summer of 1886. They named him William after Amos's father, and Gertrude recovered quickly as she had the first time, and the ranch absorbed the new life as it absorbed all things, with the good solid continuity of a place that knew how to endure. Amos's mother, a small energetic woman named Amos Sullivan, who had the same unhurried attentiveness as her son, came west from Kentucky in the autumn of that year, making the train journey to Caldwell with an independence that charmed everyone she met. She stayed through the winter, and Gertrude found in her a woman she understood immediately, someone who had made her own life on her own terms and was not inclined to apologize for it. They got along very well. Helen went back to Kentucky in the spring with a promise to return, and she kept it, coming every other autumn for the next decade, a regular and welcome presence. The ranch grew steadily through the 1880s, each year adding something: the herd numbers, the fence quality, the water management, the south field production. They hired Billy Cross permanently in 1887, a capable and loyal hand who had learned ranching properly and who knew better than to offer Gertrude unsolicited advice on the running of the operation. Gertrude Slater Sullivan was 30 years old when the 1880s ended, and she stood in her kitchen on a January morning looking at the account books for the year and saw, in the numbers there, the cumulative record of everything she had built and continued to build, the years of work and decision and stubbornness and clear-eyed purpose that had made 40 acres of Creekside, Kansas into something real and lasting. Amos came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and looked at her over the cup and said, "How does it look?" "Good," she said. "Better than last year." "Good," he said. "Come look at the numbers with me," she said. He pulled a chair up beside her, and she walked him through the accounts, the way she did every January, the two of them together over the ledger, 2 heads bending toward the same page, the same lamp between them that had been on the table the first night she had cooked for him all those years ago. Outside, Thomas was running across the yard toward the barn, chasing something or nothing with the energy of a child who had not yet learned to ration himself. William was in the front room with a wooden horse Amos had carved him for Christmas, moving it across the floor with a commentary that was mostly sound effects. The cattle were in the winter pasture, doing well. Gertrude looked at the account books. She looked at her husband beside her, patient and present and genuinely interested in what she was showing him. She thought of hotel steps and a folded newspaper and conditions stated plainly, and a voice that said, "I'm listening already." She had no use for a man who couldn't take direction, and she had found, against all probability, the one man who had always been listening. She put her hand over his on the table, and he turned it and held hers, and outside the Kansas morning went about its business, wide and cold and beautiful, and the fence lines held, and the spring ran clear, and everything they had built together stood solid against the season. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the deep and quiet way of real things, everything.